June 12, 1995, 9:47 p.m. Beverly Hills. A quiet hotel suite, lights dimmed just enough to soften the edges of the room. The city hums outside, distant traffic, a helicopter passing somewhere above sunset, but inside the air is still. A legal pad rests on the coffee table, two coffee cups, one untouched. He sits back on the couch, jacket folded beside him, listening. Not to applause, not to pitch. To reassurance. The voice across from him is calm, professional, confident. The words are familiar, reliable, bankable, safe. The tone suggests certainty, as if the future has already been agreed upon. No pressure, no threats, just inevitability. This is how it often happens in Hollywood. By the mid-1990s, Tom Hanks has become something rare in the industry, an emotional constant. A man studios trust not just to open a movie, but to protect it, to stabilize it, to reassure investors, marketers, audiences, to make risk feel manageable. Outside the room, his name already carries a promise. Inside, the promise is starting to feel heavy. The meeting isn't dramatic. There's no argument, no raised voice, no ultimatum. It's the kind of conversation Hollywood prefers: smooth, respectful, framed as opportunity, a project that makes sense, a role that fits, a schedule that works perfectly. You can almost feel the invisible walls closing in, not around his career, but around his options. Because when you become dependable at this level, your freedom changes shape. The conversation drifts toward timing, release windows, award season positioning. He hears phrases that once felt flattering, now delivered as assumptions. He nods politely, asks careful questions, but somewhere between one sentence and the next, something shifts. It isn't anger. It isn't fear. It's recognition. That being safe has quietly become a job description. In Hollywood, safety is a currency. It keeps machines running, it smooths negotiations, it turns uncertainty into spreadsheets that make sense. And when an actor embodies safety long enough, the industry stops asking what else they might be and starts designing around what they already are. You can almost see the moment when he realizes the room isn't really asking for him anymore. It's asking for the version of him it already knows how to use. The legal pad remains untouched. This isn't about one film, or one contract, or even 1 year. It's about accumulation, the psychological residue left by being everyone's answer to risk. The slow erosion of surprise. The way creative decisions begin to arrive pre-approved, pre-framed, pre-sanitized. The meeting ends cordially, handshakes, smiles, a promise to circle back soon. But as the door closes, the quiet returns, and it feels different now. He doesn't reach for the pad, he doesn't make a call. He just sits there longer than necessary, listening to the hum outside, aware that something has already been decided. Not by them. By him. This is the part that never makes headlines. There is no announcement, no hiatus declared, no dramatic step away. What begins instead is subtler and far more disruptive. A pause, not in work but in agreement. Over the next months, calls are returned more slowly. Projects are read twice, some are declined without explanation, others are postponed with careful language: not no, not yet. Hollywood doesn't notice at first, it rarely does. Systems are built to absorb hesitation, to assume availability will eventually resume, but absence has weight, and when someone this central begins to redistribute it, the pressure moves outward. Studios start recalculating, schedules loosen, backup plans appear, the quiet understanding spreads: he isn't gone, but he's no longer automatic. This is how power changes hands in Hollywood, not through confrontation but through recalibration. For an actor defined by presence, restraint becomes the signal. And somewhere deep in the machinery of casting meetings and budget forecasts, a subtle question begins to circulate, unspoken but unmistakable. What happens if the safest man in the room stops making it easy? The industry will answer that question in time. But first, it has to realize it's been asked. The change doesn't announce itself. It never does. In Hollywood, real shifts almost always begin as scheduling problems. A project that expected an easy yes now waits, a green light drifts, a release calendar develops gaps that executives pretend not to notice. Agents smooth things over with careful language, timing issues, creative alignment, later conversations. No one panics, not yet. Because the industry is used to stars being difficult. It is not used to them being unavailable by choice. What makes this pause different is that it isn't framed as retreat. There's no exhaustion narrative, no public explanation, no reinvention tour. He still works, just not automatically. And that distinction unsettles people who depend on predictability more than they admit. Inside studios, meetings quietly change tone. You can almost hear it. If we wait for him, we lose the window. Or worse, if we plan around him, we might never start. Hollywood runs on momentum, on the illusion that everything is always moving forward. When someone with enough gravity chooses stillness, it creates drag, and drag forces decisions. What executives don't see, what they rarely consider, is that this pause isn't about leverage in the traditional sense. It isn't a negotiation tactic, it's a psychological correction. For years, every role came with an unspoken expectation, reassurance, that audiences would feel safe, that critics would be generous, that investors could relax. Over time, that expectation shapes not just the roles offered, but the internal posture of the actor receiving them. You stop being asked who you want to be. You're asked to confirm who you already are. The pause interrupts that loop. And with interruption comes discomfort. Scripts that once arrived polished now come defensive, over-explained, over-justified. Roles designed to feel different still circle the same emotional ground, like Risk wearing a familiar coat. He reads them carefully. Sometimes he imagines himself saying the lines and feels nothing. That, more than anything, becomes the signal. Because boredom at this level is dangerous. It's a warning sign that creative motion has turned into repetition disguised as prestige. So he delays. Not dramatically, not defiantly, he delays with politeness, with professionalism, with the kind of courtesy that makes it impossible to accuse him of anything at all. And slowly, something unexpected happens. The industry begins to adapt. Studios start developing projects without assuming his presence. Younger actors are elevated faster, directors recalibrate their tone, stories adjust not because he demanded change but because his absence removed a safety net. This is where the power shift actually occurs. Not when a star demands control, but when they stop providing insurance. Hollywood likes to talk about power as visibility, who is everywhere, who dominates the conversation. But influence often works in reverse. It lives in the gaps, in the meetings where someone says, "We can't rely on that anymore." That sentence carries weight, because it forces creativity to stand on its own. What emerges during this period isn't a withdrawal, it's a redefinition. He still appears, he still performs, but each choice feels more deliberate, more contained, less obligated. And people notice, not publicly but privately. Agents adjust how they pitch him, not as a guarantee but as a consideration. Directors approach differently, less transactional, more intentional. The conversations shift from "this will be good for everyone" to "this might actually matter." The psychological balance tilts. By stepping back just enough, he regains something that had quietly eroded: authorship over his own presence. And that authorship changes how others behave. Because when a figure this stable introduces uncertainty, not chaos, just unpredictability, it reorders the room. Suddenly, the industry has to meet him where he is, rather than pulling him toward where it wants him to be. That's the paradox Hollywood struggles with. The more dependable you are, the less room you're given to evolve. Until you stop being dependable on command. This pause doesn't end careers, it doesn't burn bridges, it doesn't even slow momentum in obvious ways. What it does is far more subtle and far more lasting. It teaches the system that access is not guaranteed. And once that lesson is learned, it can't be unlearned. By the late 1990s, the ripple effects are everywhere, even if no one names them. The center of gravity has shifted slightly, but enough to change trajectories. The industry moves faster around those who hesitate. And in doing so, it quietly acknowledges a truth it prefers not to face. Control doesn't always come from being indispensable. Sometimes it comes from knowing when not to be. But the full consequences of that decision, the way it reshaped perception, legacy, and long-term authority, are still unfolding. Because the most dangerous thing a system can discover is that it can function without you. And the most powerful thing you can learn is that you don't need to be there to matter. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, it's already too late to reverse. Hollywood has adjusted. Not loudly, not formally, but structurally. You can see it in the way projects are packaged, in the way casting conversations hedge earlier, in the subtle shift from he'll anchor it to let's see if he's interested. The language matters, because language reveals expectation, and expectation is where power lives. For years, the myth around him was simple: reliability equals permanence, that no matter how chaotic the business became, some figures would always be there to steady it. The pause fractures that myth without ever confronting it. And myths don't collapse all at once. They thin. Studios begin planning with redundancy, two possible leads instead of one, stories designed to be modular, flexible, easily recentered. This isn't punishment, it's adaptation. Hollywood doesn't retaliate against absence, it compensates for it. But compensation changes the ecosystem. Younger actors find space that wasn't there before, directors take chances they might have postponed, genres shift tone, the emotional center of certain films grows sharper, riskier, less buffered by reassurance. And quietly, the industry becomes more honest. Because safety, when overused, can anesthetize imagination. The pause exposes that truth. What's striking is how little resistance there is. No backlash, no whisper campaign. That absence of conflict is itself revealing. It suggests that the industry understands on some level why this is happening, even if it never articulates it. Psychologically, this is the moment where reputation and agency decouple. He is still trusted, still respected, still admired, but trust no longer implies access, admiration no longer guarantees compliance, and respect, true respect, begins to include boundaries. This is where the legacy begins to change shape. Not in box office numbers or awards, but in narrative authority. When he does return more fully, when projects appear again with his name attached, they carry a different weight. Not because he's rare, but because he's intentional. Each appearance feels chosen rather than expected. Audiences may not consciously register the shift, but they feel it. Performances land differently. There's more restraint, more interiority, less need to signal warmth, decency, reassurance. You can almost sense the actor no longer performing trust, just embodying presence. That distinction matters. Because performing trust is exhausting, it requires constant calibration to audience comfort. Embodying presence, by contrast, allows complexity, ambiguity, even silence. And silence in Hollywood is often mistaken for absence until it starts shaping behavior. Industry insiders begin to talk differently, not in press but in private, about how difficult it's become to count on certain people, about how unpredictable availability has forced better preparation, about how some stars now carry more influence by doing less. This isn't cynicism, it's recalibration. And it reveals a deeper truth about power in creative systems. Visibility is not control. Consistency is not authority. And availability is not obligation. The pause teaches Hollywood something it rarely learns willingly, that the system adapts fastest not to dominance but to withdrawal. What makes this moment endure isn't that it changed one career, it's that it offered a template, a demonstration that stepping back doesn't diminish relevance, it can redefine it. Other figures would later echo this behavior, consciously or not: strategic absences, selective engagement, careers shaped less by output and more by timing. But this was earlier, quieter, less studied. And that's why it worked. Because no one could accuse it of strategy. It looked like instinct. By refusing to always be present, he allowed the industry to reveal its own dependencies. And once exposed, those dependencies lost their grip. The myth of the reliable star didn't die. It evolved into something more durable, more human, less transactional. By the early 2000s, the shift is complete, not declared, not documented, but felt. His name now carries not just trust but discretion, not just safety but judgment. And judgment in Hollywood is rare. Because it can't be leveraged, it can't be rushed, it can't be outsourced. It can only be respected. What began as a private decision in a quiet room has now altered the shape of influence around him, not by confrontation, not by retreat, but by restraint. And restraint, it turns out, travels further than noise ever could. Yet the most important consequence of that night, the one that would ultimately define his legacy, has nothing to do with the industry at all. It has to do with what happens to a person when they stop confusing usefulness with worth. That realization comes last. And it changes everything. The final shift doesn't happen in a boardroom. It happens internally. By the time the industry has fully adjusted, by the time schedules no longer assume his availability and projects no longer lean on his presence for emotional insurance, something quieter has already settled into place. A different relationship with power. You can feel it in the way decisions are made now. Fewer explanations, less justification, no need to persuade anyone that a choice is valid. The absence of urgency becomes its own authority. This is where restraint turns into control. Not the kind that dictates outcomes, the kind that defines conditions. Hollywood has always been fluent in dominance, box office leverage, awards, clout, marketability, but this is something else. This is power that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. The system has already adapted. Psychologically, this marks a crossing point. The burden of being useful dissolves. In its place emerges something rarer in celebrity culture, self-containment, a sense that worth no longer fluctuates with demand. For an actor once defined by reassurance, this is a profound recalibration. He no longer carries the emotional labor of stabilizing the room. He enters it as himself or not at all, and that choice alone reshapes interactions. Directors approach differently, conversations slow down. The pitch isn't about safety anymore, it's about meaning, about whether the story justifies presence rather than whether presence will justify the story. That inversion is everything. It's also why the legacy hardens instead of fading. Because longevity in Hollywood isn't sustained by staying visible, it's sustained by staying sovereign. The industry senses this even if it can't articulate it. You hear it in the phrasing, "He doesn't need this." That sentence, spoken often in hushed admiration, signals a shift in hierarchy. When someone doesn't need the system treats them differently. Not with fear, with deference. What's remarkable is how little spectacle accompanies this change. No grand statements, no reinvention arcs, just a steady pattern of choice, of appearing when it matters and disappearing when it doesn't. Audiences feel the difference. The performances that emerge from this phase carry more silence, more weight between lines, less eagerness to resolve emotional tension for the viewer's comfort. You can almost sense the actor trusting the audience to meet him halfway. That trust flows both ways. And it creates something Hollywood rarely produces on purpose: emotional durability. This is the final consequence of that quiet night in the mid-1990s, not an altered career trajectory, but an altered center of gravity. A shift from being an instrument of the industry to being a presence within it. From function to authorship. The system didn't punish this. It reorganized around it. Which may be the clearest proof of where real power resides. Not in constant output. Not in dominance. But in the ability to withhold. Because when absence is chosen rather than imposed, it speaks louder than presence ever could. That is the lesson Hollywood absorbed, slowly, reluctantly, permanently. And it's why the most reliable star didn't lose influence by stepping back. He discovered where it actually came from.